This is Rejected Knowledge, and this is Chapter 3 of Part 2 of Lords of the Press by George Seldes. Part 2, Chapter 3, The Plutogogues. Serve a press lord, and you will know what sorrow is. Serve any other businessman, and you sell your hands or feet, and perhaps some intelligence. But there are very few of the 49 million jobs in America which involve integrity. Hear, hear. It's because we're living in Babylon. Most all the 40,000 newspaper jobs do. The editor, the headline writer, the Washington and foreign correspondent are involved with their conscience every day, provided they have such a thing. And even the lowly wild police reporter at times must struggle with the devil in making his news truthful and honest. In addition to the regular newspaper staffs, there have arrived in prominence lately 2 new groups whose writings are having a more and more subtle and powerful influence on politically intelligent Americans. One group has been labeled Plutogogues. The other consists of a dozen famed columnists who cooperate in a semi-independent fashion because their vast income is from syndication rather than the lone newspaper which has served as their springboard to fame and wealth. The Plutogogue is not new, but the name is. Let the inventor define. Addressing the Institute of Human Relations, Dr. T.V. Smith, professor of philosophy of the University of Chicago, practical politician, he is a member of the Illinois State Senate, and author of many books, including The Promise of American Politics, some promise, said the enemies of our democracy are demagogues, plutogogues, and theogogues. Quote, Demagogue we all know as the personage who mistakes the empty echo of his own cadences for the very heartbeats of humanity. Plutogogue, however, is not so well known nor so easily identified. Plutogogue is the voice of the wealthy when they can no longer speak for themselves, the successor of the plutocrat of other days. He is not Allah, but Allah's Public Relations Council. You will hear his soft-spoken message in the columns of our sophisticated Walter Lippmann's and our unctuous Glenn Frank's. You will see or gently feel his gloved hand in the eulogistic releases of our late Ivy Lees and our ever-present Edward Bernays. Folks, he just listed a who's who of reprobates. Walter Lippmann and Ivy Lee were spoken prominently about in Rose Martin's Fabian Freeway. Walter Lippmann and Ivy Lee were formative in the founding of, it's the American version, the sister society to the British Fabian Socialists. I forget the name of it. It has an acronym, as Americans love those acronyms. But Walter Lippmann, Ivy Lee, you could throw them in as American Fabian Socialists, basically. And you know who Edward Bernays is. He wrote Crystallizing Public Opinion and Propaganda. He was the nephew of Sigmund Freud, and Edward Bernays was the godfather of psychological propaganda in the media, subliminal messages, getting women to smoke, getting poisonous pharmaceuticals sold. There's your Edward Bernays. Continuing. These men perform wonders in ectoplasmic surgery, lifting fallen faces, enlivening sullen eyes, and in emergencies grafting entirely new reputations upon financial satyrs who need only to be known in order to be rightfully despised. Who let these elegant lackeys hoodwink us, join them to constitute the Plutogoggery of democracy," unquote. In an interview with May Cameron, Dr. Smith enlarged the definition. He said that, quote, "We are all more or less in a jitter, out of fear of outer enemies. But we would not be so afraid if we did not suspect inner enemies who might open the gates to them, the demagogues who promise only what God could perform, the Plutogogues who lend their voices to the defense of the wealthy men, when the wealthy can no longer defend themselves, and the Theogogues who start by claiming in religion differential access to the deity, and who end by forgetting that they themselves are not God. Democracy needs men who have learned the lesson that the late Justice Holmes said had saved him from many an error, namely, that he was not God," unquote. The majority of Plutogogues, as distinguished from columnists, are not newspaper men. They may be diplomats, college professors, politicians, or persons of neither ability nor intelligence, who have become public figures and therefore useful to these special interests. In some instances, they are just plain crooks. In other cases, they are hired prostitutes of big business. In all instances, they are the voice of the plutocrats, as Dr. Smith has said, and the enemies of the general reader. The newspapers which employ or publish the work of the extreme Plutogogues, that is, the hired agents of such special interests as the Italian government or the National Electric Light Association or the National Association of Manufacturers, and do so knowingly, are, without question, violating every canon in the code of ethical journalism. They are doing exactly what the majority of the French press has always done, except for the bigger profits involved. In France, you can buy a favorable review for your play, painting, or book for 1,000 francs. The middle group of Plutogogues consists of men who are not bought up for fat sums of money, but who are hired by either newspapers or big business because their policies agree. It is, of course, difficult to differentiate among the college professors who spread the NELA propaganda against public ownership of public utilities because they believed in private ownership, and those professors who did so for NELA money. In either case, it was an action against the public interest because it was done for private interests. But the most important group of Plutogogues consists of important and usually wealthy men, including some columnists, who, honest or dishonest in their avowal of liberalism and freedom of the press, become the spokesmen of the plutocrats voluntarily. No one hires them to do a job of work. No one bribes them to change their views. They are not tempted by the big money which is always on the right, the reactionary or big business plutocratic side, because they themselves are wealthy enough. They have simply become part of the same ruling setup, giving it their services free, while other men doing the same work call their wages the wages of prostitution. Peace be to the ashes of Richard Washburn Child, but for many years he was the worst of the Plutogogues, the paid agent of the Electric Light Trust and the fascist government. He was also one of the hired hands of the Hearst red-baiting campaign against college professors and teachers. Another deceased prostitute Plutogogue was Arthur Brisbane, a renegade socialist, who made $250,000 per year by serving Hearst, and who had his moments of remorse, but not in his syndicated columns. There he called the income tax and partial inheritance tax plans confiscatory. In the Boston American 1935, they were confiscatory. They were, sometimes this author doesn't understand the socialist that he is. And uttered reaction. This is back when they thought the income tax was just for rich folks, going to sock it to the rich. Yeah, right. And before they realized that, a graduated income tax is one of the 10 planks to Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto. Continuing. Quote, the United States Chamber of Commerce objects to the income and inheritance tax program, calls it confiscation. The question involved seems simple. Does the property of the United States, well, that's a corporation right there, results of thrift and intelligence, belong to the people that created it, or is it only held in trust by them for public use? It's held in trust. It is, because of what's been done to us, yeah. We live in a corporation, and we deal in commerce, so they're giving us the privilege to use their Federal Reserve notes, so it's held in trust by them for public use, yes. For the time being, exercise powers of government. The American theory, until recently, was that what a man had acquired without violation of law, usually by working, was his property. Yeah, that was some theory, huh? But the scriptural theory, the scriptural law, that's the only way we're going to have property. Continuing, this is a rich country, but all the property put together wouldn't satisfy the social needs of the masses if the masses decided not to work. Unquote. Readers of the Hearst Press for years have been asked to sympathize with the large taxpayers. Whether or not this appeal to public opinion was ordered by Hearst himself, I do not know, but Hearst employees, as a rule, do not need the daily specific order to know what to write. When Hearst opposes taxation, every columnist opposes taxation. Frequently, Mr. Arthur Brisbane came forward with daily little paragraphs castigating government for increasing taxation. So what? Real estate taxation especially annoyed this columnist, and on one or more occasions he mentioned the needs of the hotel industry especially. Mr. Brisbane, according to a test by Fortune, was the foremost columnist in popularity. He appeared regularly in 180 newspapers and supposedly reached the eye, if not the so-called mind, of 30 million readers. It is a safe bet that less than 1% of them knew that Brisbane and Hearst were large real estate and hotel operators, and Brisbane was nothing more than a propagandist and plutogogue when he wrote against taxation of his hotel real estate. Folks, this is frustrating. The problem is not... The author's right that these plutocrats and their plutogogues are indeed looking out for themselves, and they're in cahoots behind the scenes to propagandize you. However, and to get out of taxes, but it's the tax-exempt foundations and their dynastic inheritances that are the real problem. Because the plutocrats can avoid taxes, inevitably anyway, just like they avoided monopolies, the robber barons did. And by the time they did something about the monopolies, they had already established theirs, and that was just their way of paying the politicians to shut the door so that nobody could catch up to the robber barons' monopolies anymore. So we have dynasties in this nation that are the real government, just as Scripture warned, and that's why Scripture had a Jubilee year every 50 years, so you couldn't establish dynasties like that. So the problem... the author is in favor of the income tax, which is asinine. I'm sorry. Even back in 1938, just asinine. Because it's one of the planks of the Communist Manifesto. And if you think that the rich are gonna get theirs, Come on. Come on. You can write an intelligent book like this where you see through propaganda and the press lords and the scumbags and the propagandists, and you can't realize that you're being lied to also about the income tax, that it's not really only for the rich. It never was going to be. It's always going to be foisted upon, burdened, always going to be foisted upon the poor guy in the middle class, to crush them down. Always. What were they thinking back then? Intelligent people like this George Seldes guy. I may quit this book soon. I can't take any more of this. I mean, I appreciate that he's exposing the press lords. I don't appreciate that he's falling for some of the propaganda while he's identifying other parts of the propaganda. Continuing. And when it came to labor troubles in real estate, especially in the hotel business, these two hotel keepers were pulling their hair in fright. Brisbane yelled, "Red Revolution!" Quote, "You hear a little talk of revolution in the United States, and you may hear more," unquote. He wrote in a column of February 16th, 1935, when an elevator strike threatened. Quote, "It does not sound quite as silly as it did at first. The present threat of a labor union to tie up New York City, its hotels, apartments, and office buildings," unquote, in all of which these two entrepreneurs had big interests, quote, "reminds you that if the United States government refuses to go the whole way in its recognition of organized labor as the real ruling power in the United States," real ruling power, like that's not the plutocrats, huh? "Organized labor might well form the nucleus of a revolutionary movement to overthrow existing government," unquote. The real ruling power is not the labor class. It's the rich people. Easy test, real easy test. And this was identified by Dr. Ferdinand Lundberg in the giant book from 1967, which is out of print, of course, called The Rich and the Super Rich. He asked the simple question. First, he said, down through history, it's really easy to identify who the government is, who the ruling power is in any civilization, from Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Rome, Greece, all of them, Byzantium. Real easy. Who's the ruling power? Who's really running the government? Look around, see who is living in the biggest mansions, the biggest palaces. There's your real government. Who lives in the biggest mansions today? This is the question he asks. Who lives in the biggest mansions today? The biggest palaces? Do the puppet politicians? No. Who does? The Rockefellers, the Mellons, the Fords, the Carnegies, the Vanderbilts, the DuPonts, the dynastic ruling classes, the robber barons. There's our government. Continuing. Here we have an example of two important situations in present-day journalism. The publisher, as real estate or other business operator, using his paper for private ends, and the plutogog disguising special pleading as defense of the general welfare. Coincident with the secret meetings of the American National Publishers Association have been the meetings of the National Association of Manufacturers. The publishers discussed ways of fighting the labor movement, and so did the manufacturers. In fact, the manufacturers named 5 pieces of legislation they wanted defeated or emasculated: the Wagner Act, the Wages and Hour Bill, the Chain Store Tax, Little TVA, the Bora O'Mahony Industry Licensing Bill. My authority for the foregoing statement is a Dow Jones report. There is no authority for stating that exactly the measures which the National Association of Manufacturers wanted, or killed, were supported or attacked by collusion with the publishers, but a survey proves that in these 5 measures the publishers did what the manufacturers suggested. Perhaps it was a coincidence. Perhaps it has been a coincidence for a quarter of a century that the policies of the NAM have been the policies of the ANPA. But the La Follette Civil Liberties Committee has questioned that view. It has investigated the NAM and proved to those who read liberal weeklies and the few who get the free newspapers, that the NAM is the most persistent and powerful lobby against liberal and labor legislation in the country. That, in addition to spending millions of dollars for spies and thugs and vigilante and subversive movements, as Senator La Follette and his chief investigator, Captain Robert Wohlforth, proved with documentary evidence, it is also the worst propaganda agency in the country at present. In the 1920s, the National Electric Light Association spent about $25 million bribing the press. In the 1930s, the NAM is spending millions to, quote-unquote, influence the newspapers. Senator La Follette proved that since the passage of the Wagner-Connery Labor Relations Act in 1935, until sometime in 1937, when Captain Wohlforth made his investigation, the manufacturer's propaganda department spent $1,350,000 waging war on that bill. Walter B. Weissenberger, executive vice president of the NAM, admitted at the hearing that 5,900 newspapers today are using what he calls, quote-unquote, news and features which his propaganda agency is furnishing them free. Weissenberger objected to Captain Wohlforth's introduction of evidence he had seized in NAM files showing that, although the organization consists of 4,000 members, who employ 4 million working men, it is actually a dictatorship of 207 industrialists, notably the DuPonts, Chrysler, Weir, Rand, Sloan, and a few other quote-unquote leaders. 60% of all the poison gas purchased by all industrial firms in the United States for labor warfare between 1933 and October 1937 was bought by these 207 industrialists who run the NAM. Wohlforth discovered by going through the gas company records, and he testified further that the books of the industrial detective agencies he had seized or subpoenaed showed the same men are the largest employers of labor spies, 55 of the big men of the NAM alone, spending $2,500,000 for stool pigeons in 4 years. These same 207 leaders of American industry were proven to be the subsidizers of vigilante and reactionary and pre- or pro-fascist organizations. Testimony was given that the supposedly spontaneous Johnstown Citizens Committee was financed by the industrialists. Sounds like the Tea Party. Other organizations named were the Liberty League, the Crusaders, the Sentinels of America, National Economy League, and the so-called Farmers' Independence Council. The largest contributors to the propaganda fund are the big business monopolies and the anti-labor industrialists. Notably, E.I. DuPont de Nemours and Company, General Motors, Standard Oil, Chrysler, Swift and Company, Weirton Steel, Bethlehem Steel, Republic Steel, Westinghouse, Remington Rand, and the American Smelting and Refining Company. In 1934, the NAM spent $26,500 for publicity, but the annual fund grew until it reached $793,000 in 1937. Ernest T. Weir of National Steel was the chief collector. The money was spent for propaganda via the following channels: Industrial Press Service, clip sheet, sent to 5,500 newspapers. Quote-unquote, Uncle Abner Says, given to 300 daily newspapers. Harmony Campaign, furnished 367 newspapers. You and Your Nation's Affairs, 250 daily newspapers. Let's Go America, shown in 2,812 movie houses. The American Family Robinson, heard over 268 radio stations. George Sokolsky Program, over 246 stations. Quote-unquote, Industrial Facts, a bulletin of industrial propaganda, sophistries, doctored figures, supplied working men at plants. Quote-unquote, You and Your Nation's Affairs is also known as, quote-unquote, Six-Star Service. It consists of the writings of 8 professors, mostly economists, whose knowledge of national affairs and economics is so magnificent that it fits exactly into the manufacturer's pattern. One paper in each city and town was given the right to publish, free of charge, daily, the stuff produced by these men. The noted authors are Professor Gus Dyer of Vanderbilt University, Professor Clarence W. Fackler of New York University, Professor Elliot Jones of Stanford, Professor Lutz of Princeton, Professor Walter E. Spar of New York University, Professor James S. Thomas of Clarkson College of Technology, Professor Ernest Patterson of the Academy of Political and Social Science. These articles appeared in newspapers without any statement as to their hidden origin. The Senate Lobbying Committee immediately took notice. It found that one of the writers, President Thomas of Clarkson, had figured in the Federal Trade Commission investigation of utility company propaganda, the old NELA $25 million a year slush fund. The committee reported to the Senate that Thomas, while in charge of extension work for the University of Alabama, received $10,500 from the Alabama Utilities Information Bureau, Birmingham Electric, and Alabama Power Company. Quote, America's biggest propaganda network, unquote, was shown by the La Follette Committee to be spending an average annually of $500,000. Most of the opium for the people was dispensed in palatable doses via the newspapers. One of the documents was a letter from a Missouri editor who wrote, quote, Because of the known prejudices of our people, we have not credited Washington snapshots to your news services, as we have believed, under the circumstances, that it would carry more weight without being so credited, unquote. Parenthesis. A nice case of prostitution, my lords, but, quote, the American press is not venal, unquote, end parenthesis. If the reader finds the greater part of the foregoing story of the NAM propaganda machine and its machinations in the newspaper of America new, he will himself confirm the charge by members of the La Follette Committee that the newspapers generally either suppressed the hearings or buried the news in exactly the same way 4/5 of the American press did with the utilities exposure of 1929. There never was any freedom of the press. Not in the 20th century in this country. The press suppressed and buried this story alive because it is the most up-to-the-minute indictment of itself. The investigation proved that, journalistically, things have not changed from the days of the NELA Corruption Fund. It makes impossible the usual editorial explanation that all the charges deal with past history, that the evil condition has long been cured. When the NAM held its 1938 convention in New York, the press presented it with the front page and all the inside space it could use for its reactionary programs and speeches. It printed the hymns of hate of industry against the New Deal. It reported President George Cutton of Colgate saying, quote, "God is a reactionary. What would happen if God started a New Deal every day?" Unquote. And his philosophy about the, quote-unquote, proletariat, the lowest class, unquote, being in the world only for the purpose of reproducing itself and carrying on the heavy work. Oh, spoken like a true Eloi, right? No, Eloi were the proletariats, the Morlocks. Spoken like a true Morlock there. The press of the land lionized the NAM and tried to make a monkey out of the Senate investigation of the same organization. The honest plutogog and out-in-the-open plutogog, the agent for big business who is not a hypocrite or a sinister, underhand propagandist, is generally known as a public relations counsel, and the most noted or notorious of them was the late Ivy Lee, who, before his death, was completely exposed as advisor to Hitler in America. Advisor to Hitler in America. Beautiful. Beautiful. The McCormick-Dickstein Committee also exposed the firm of Carl Bayer and Associates as Hitler propagandists. Bayer previously had played the same game for the brutal tyrant Machado of Cuba. In 1938, Bayer was press agent for Republican China. I mention the fact to show that the plutogog is merely the hired mouth of an individual, a corporation, or a state, which speaks its piece regardless of right or wrong, good or evil. The same plutogog who spread the propaganda for tyrants and murderous big business in Cuba and Germany will, for a fee, help the distressed people of China in their war against the Japanese tyrants. The plutogog of plutogogs is, you guessed it, Edward L. Bernays, who usually hires himself for the better causes, the democratic nations, but he is also the best defender of our business civilization. For example, he has sent out wholesale his piece entitled Presenting American Business, with the subtitle, quote, "Present-day business sails little-known waters, studded with the bars and shoals of adverse public opinion. Small wonder that the captains of industry need advice from a pilot, the Public Relations Council," unquote. In the light of the NELA and the NAM investigations, the obvious reply is that business has, by bribery and advertising and other pressures, and the employment of plutogogs galore, been caught influencing the public against the public welfare, and what business needs is not more public relations counsel, but a new relationship with the public. Parenthesis. A new relationship must affect business profits, and history teaches us that business has engaged in wars and organized fascist regimes rather than share profits with employees, so it is natural to expect new propaganda campaigns rather than a new philosophy. End parenthesis. Business has listened to the Plutogog rather than to the man of goodwill. But, quote, businessmen are just as subject to being led astray by Plutogogs as farmers and laboring men are to being led astray by demagogues, unquote, said Secretary of Agriculture Wallace recently. Quote, they have been led by their Plutogogs to believe that government rules of the game should be loaded in their favor, unquote. And John T. Flynn feels that the collection of apologies for rackets on the stock exchange, quote, which have been fabricated for it by third- and fourth-rate college professors at so much per fabrication, unquote, constitutes a distressing phenomenon. The press of the nation, of course, is open to all men so long as they write on the side of money. Writing for the side of money naturally means writing against labor and the liberal and progressive movements. For example, the New York Times gives 3 columns, August 8, 1937, to the views of President Samuel Hardin Church of Carnegie Institute, which are summed up in the heading, Labor May Block Entrance to Period of Prosperity. In order to prevent this, it is held, just demands must be met, radical leaders ousted, and former spirit of loyalty renewed by mutual fair play. Here the Plutogog is his smiling, sinister best. He speaks of the coming era of the greatest prosperity in American history, quote, if only her labor population can be restored to their former spirit of loyalty by satisfaction and contentment through a cordial concession to their just and humane demands, unquote. He denounces, quote, the ugly and vociferous demands of ambitious and mercenary labor leaders. One big union and a closed shop, unquote. He favors, quote, loyalty as the first essential to tranquility in industry, unquote. He mourns the passing of the day when American workmen referred, quote, with pride and trust to our company as if it really belonged to them, unquote. What a bunch of lying bastards. And the, quote, contented and happy cooperation in a system which seemed to be steadily advancing toward a higher standard of living, unquote. In other words, the Plutogog deplores the awakening of labor, which has been doped by the opium of the Plutogogs. He refuses to see or cannot see the difference between loyalty and industrial serfdom. Furthermore, he calls the new type of labor leaders, who is divorcing union labor from racketeering and building an enlightened, socially conscious organization, which intends to use the political as well as the economic weapon for the betterment of the vast majority of the people. He calls them, quote-unquote, ambitious and mercenary. I know Samuel Hardin Church very well. Pittsburgh reporters all know him. His utterances are quote-unquote must. They may be nonsense, but they are nonsense which fights for the employers and the rich lords he serves. Here is the head of an educational institution who, in the social field, would obstruct the spread of education and liberty and thought. A typical volunteer Plutogogue. We have now had examples of the three classes: the prostitute Plutogogue, the hired man, the volunteer. The National Association of Manufacturers also sends out propaganda which consists of the writings of noted men and women which agree with the ideology of American reactionary big business. For example, there is the pamphlet entitled, quote, "What's Going On in America?" unquote, which the NAM disseminated in midsummer 1937. The oracles contained therein are General Hugh S. Johnson, Frank R. Kent, David Lawrence, Walter Lippmann, Westbrook Pegler, and Dorothy Thompson. All six are daily columnists. Okay, folks, that was Chapter 3 of Part 2 of Lords of the Press by George Seldes. We'll be back in a few minutes with Chapter 4, Part 2 of Lords of the Press. See you in a few. We're back. Time for Chapter 4 of Part 2 of Lords of the Press by George Seldes. Chapter 4 of Part 2, The Wages of Reaction. The majority of columnists are conservative at best, reactionary at worst, wealthy, successful members of polo clubs, friends of the moneybags, members of the ruling class. Morally, many of them were left dead on the shores of journalism many years ago. Materially, they have gained the highest places in the country, and their power is great and growing. I have known about a dozen of the leading columnists of America, and I have watched more than one, who had taken the vows of journalistic poverty, chastity, and humility, and then go whoring after the big money and the bitch goddess success. I have known one who is now syndicated in about 150 newspapers, and read by perhaps 5 million, who was intensely for Karl Marx only a few years ago, and today would prefer the triumph of Mussolini's ideology in America. And for what reason? Quote, "Because a reactionary victory would not disturb my estate, whereas a radical movement, which I still believe in, and which I hope will triumph, say 50 years from now, would destroy what I have built up for my family," unquote. Some of our best-known columnists, who once got their ideas from Marx, Veblen, Henry George, Mill, Adam Smith, Thomas Paine, Walt Whitman, Jefferson, and Voltaire, now run to Thomas Lamont, Wendell Willkie, Albert Lasker, Alex Sachs, Benjamin Anderson, and the quote-unquote economists of the Chase National Bank for their enlightenment. And not one of them believes he has quote-unquote changed or sold out. He has merely grown up and become more intelligent and more realistic. They never question their own integrity or their own ethics.
They see themselves as leaders of men, giving profound and useful philosophical advice to a confused people, providing intelligence for the masses, and helping to preserve the nation from experiments and from sudden change in the status quo. William Allen White has pointed out the corruption of social relations upon editors who want to publish a free newspaper, but this pressure is even stronger upon a man or woman who begins to syndicate a column of views and is suddenly made the pet of every mercenary organization in the country, showered with orders for lectures, articles, testimonials, with invitations to speak, dine, join, discuss, debate, participate, and lead. The columnists of the liberal and left wings have to fight for their existence. The columnists for the big money have nothing to do but write their apologies and wrestle with the devil occasionally. Rare indeed is the person who grows old without growing conservative and suffering from a disintegration of the mind. But the most tragic figures of all are those columnists who stalwartly proclaim they are still the bold, bright, radical minds of their college days, that they alone march along the straight path to a nobler life, while all their old friends have either fallen into the gutter on the right or down the radical precipices of the left. There are many such renegades, but so far as is generally known, there is only one case of a columnist who, while plying his trade in a cheap, reactionary way, was also taking the money of the special interests whom he was always defending. This action may be legal on his part, but what about the ethics of the publisher who hires him and continues to publish him even after he has been exposed? Let me quote from the Nye Vandenberg senatorial investigation of the munitions industry. One of the quote-unquote merchants of death was being interrogated about sales to China and Japan. Quote, Senator Clark, reading a letter from a munitions maker. Along further in that letter, in the second paragraph, on the second page, you say, quote, so you would know what we are doing, we gave you in confidence the name of George Sokolsky, who is now in New York, and, according to our information, although he does not say so himself, Mr. Sokolsky represents the Soong interests. You know Mr. T.V. Soong is the Chinese finance minister, and his sister is the wife of President Chiang Kai-shek. At our request, Mr. Sokolsky, about 2 weeks ago, sent a cable in his private code to Mr. T.V. Soong, asking if he was interested in obtaining supplies of 7-9 cartridges, but so far no response has come in, unquote. So you identify Mr. Sokolsky, whom you had send cables over to China for you. Mr. Monahan. I do not recall how I met Mr. Sokolsky. I did not meet him in New York at that time. Senator Clark. During that time he was a foreign correspondent for the New York Times, wasn't he? Mr. Monahan. I recall reading articles of his in the New York Times that impressed me greatly. Senator Clark. That was his ostensible business, was it not? Being a correspondent for the New York Times? Mr. Monahan. I do not know. Senator Clark. Mr. Sokolsky, so I am informed, is now touring the United States, lecturing in the interests of the necessity for heavy armaments. Unquote. Several years ago, Agnes Smedley, writing on China's corrupt press, described the various English-language publications in the Far East, which are subsidized by the Chinese and Japanese governments. She mentioned, quote, "The Far Eastern Review, an American-owned and registered engineering monthly, which is openly financed by the Japanese. The owner and editor is George Bronson Ray. When Mr. Ray was away from China on his sacred mission of aiding Japanese imperialism, his position on the Review was taken for a time by another American, George Sokolsky. Mr. Sokolsky, however, seemed a bit more broad-minded than Mr. Ray, for he traveled back and forth between the Review office and the office of the Ministry of Finance of the Nanking government, with occasional side trips to the British consulate." Unquote. Sokolsky, however, not only survived the Nye exposure, but apparently used it as a stepping stone to a bigger job. If we had a free press in America, the biggest scandal of recent years would have been the exposure by the La Follette Investigating Committee of the National Association of Manufacturers and the part this same Sokolsky played. But because we do not have a free press, we got practically no news about the La Follette hearings in January to April 1938, and only a column story on Sokolsky in July. Sokolsky is one of the columnists of the right. It is true he is the extreme right. He is right next door to fascism. He is playing exactly the same role which several other fascist Jewish columnists played as agents for the Ruhr industrialists in Germany before 1933. There are probably no other well-known columnists who are secretly in the pay of advertising and publicity bureaus, steel institutes, manufacturers' associations, and chambers of commerce, but there is little difference between the writings of George E. Sokolsky and a dozen of his right-wing colleagues. Sikorsky is not a journalistic prostitute. In journalism, as in real life, a line must be drawn between the inmates of houses of prostitution, known years ago as quote-unquote white slaves, miserable victims of violence and terror for whom there was no escape, and women of a higher level of society who enjoy the association of wealthy men, serve them well, and cannot refuse the regular wage. Sokolsky merely worked for the manufacturers while appearing in the columns of the New York Herald Tribune and several other newspapers as an impartial journalist. When Sokolsky returned from China penniless, he became a freelance writer. He wrote an article, "America Drifts Toward Fascism," in which he heard, quote, "rumbling, sympathetic reactions to the fascism in the New Deal," unquote, and in which he exposed the Silver Shirts, also, quote, "a fascist organization called the Vigilantes, managed by Harry Augustus Jung, one of many anti-communist propaganda groups tending toward fascism," unquote. After naming a dozen organizations but not stating what Liberty Leaguers, manufacturers, and other moneyed interests are behind them, Sokolsky warns against dismissing them and their Hitlers and Mussolinis as ridiculous, and concludes that the soil in America is ready for fascism, quote, and the New Deal is, in a very real sense, the father of all these fascistic tendencies, unquote. In another article, A Noble Defense of American Jews, he attacked the numerous myths, forgeries, and propaganda against the race and paid homage to those members who preferred the cultivation of talent to that of wealth. He lauds Einstein, Michelson, Ellman, Epstein, Walter Lippmann, Professor Seligman, Justices Brandeis and Cardoso. But when next heard from, Sokolsky had written a book, Labor's Fight for Power, a book against labor. It did not have much of a sale, but in dinner conversations, Sokolsky hinted he was making good money. The Nation said at that time that, quote, if Mr. Sokolsky's book has not been subsidized by the National Association of Manufacturers, it should have been, unquote. The Nation reviewer either had inside information or a prophetic soul. In 1936, we find Sokolsky running a column on the Herald Tribune and syndicating it to 25 other papers. On April 20th, 1936, he calls his colleague Dorothy Thompson to task for getting excited about thugs who break strikes and the 200 detective agencies which intimidate laborers from joining unions. Quote, who hired these agencies? Why not give the names of the agencies? Unquote, he asks bravely. The answer is that the members of the NAM employ both him and the thugs, as was revealed in due time. A week later, he attacks Heber Blankenhorn, La Follette Committee expert, for daring to say that industry employs detectives, spies, and strikebreakers. Sokolsky calls this statement a publicity trick, a circus trick. The statement should not be allowed to stand. Sokolsky calls on Blankenhorn to prove it or shut up. Well, it was proved, 100%. And in the course of the La Follette proving came the exposure of Sokolsky. In August 1936, this agent for the Steel Institute and the manufacturers began writing for the Atlantic Monthly, parentheses, then under the editorship of a man named Ellery Sedgwick, who ended a long literary life by becoming the chief defender of the child murderer Franco in Spain, end parenthesis. Wrote Sokolsky, quote, I speak as a conservative. In my youth I ran the gamut of revolutionary movements, anarchist, pacifist, IWW sympathizer. I have sought a better, a more commodious life, not only for myself, but for all men. Let no man think of me as a Tory, a heartless marauder in a predatory world, for I have nothing to defend. I have nothing of the goods of this world but what I earn and consume today, unquote. This was about the time Sokolsky told me he had arrived penniless from China and had now salted away more than $15,000 in the bank. In all his magazine articles, Sokolsky masquerades as a penniless liberal, the true American who believes in freedom for all, and while he seems to attack fascism, with the equal vigor he belabors communism, he is actually using both merely as foils to show the benefit of the American big business system. But he has now become a prominent figure in our journalism. He is worth the attention of the liberal press, and he gets it. An editorial in the New York Post recalls that during the Manchurian crisis, Sokolsky, quote, seemed anxious for the world to understand Japan's civilizing mission in China, unquote. And now he has become a labor expert whose articles are, quote, reprinted by the manufacturers' associations and Hawaiian pineapple interests and distributed broadly to fill editors' wastebaskets, unquote. But when Sokolsky attacks John L. Lewis and the CIO and speaks about a communist, socialist CIO plot to elect Lewis president in 1940, the Post brings up contrary proof from the Wall Street Journal, which also laughs at Sokolsky and concludes with the advice that, quote, Mr. Sokolsky had better peddle his red herrings elsewhere. Even the Wall Street market insists on fresh fish these days, unquote. Much stronger advice is given the lesser of Sokolsky's employers, the Herald Tribune, by the Nation, October 24th, 1936. If the Herald Tribune had taken it, it would not now be standing naked to its enemies. The Nation said, quote, the New York Herald Tribune is a conservative newspaper, dignified, well-edited, and lively. The liberal reader may feel that Walter Lippmann has gone over to the enemy with altogether too much gusto, or that Dorothy Thompson's sympathies lie too far to the right to be consistent with her experience in Hitler's Germany. As for Mark Sullivan, he is almost an appealing figure, as he stands roundly in the ranks of red-baiters, much more vicious than himself, still striking out at Tugwell with his trusty cutlass. Even a Red would scarcely accuse these writers of being worse than conservative or reactionary. There is, however, one burned-out star in the Herald Tribune's galaxy which should be replaced before it short-circuits the whole string. We refer to George E. Sokolsky. On October 19th, Mr. Sokolsky wrote an article on the American Labor Party, maintaining his old pretense of being an expert on labor and radicalism. Parentheses, some of his best friends are radicals. End parentheses. He cooked up a mess of misrepresentation, labor, Jew, and alien baiting, which Sokolsky himself has seldom surpassed. We feel that the Herald Tribune, aside from soiling its pages, is keeping apart two minds that run as one. Isn't it possible that Mr. Sokolsky could be auctioned off to William Randolph Hearst? He long ago reached the stage of journalistic ripeness, which usually precedes that fall. End quote. But the Herald Tribune continued to peddle the red herrings, for which Sokolsky is getting paid double or more by the manufacturers' associations. The propagandist continued to attack labor and the New Deal, and to charge it and Lewis, quote, spearhead of the revolutionary movement in labor, unquote, with plotting the overthrow of the government. When the Newspaper Guild went from the AF of L, quote unquote, that body of death, to the CIO, the Herald Tribune permitted Sokolsky to publish one of his wildest, most nonsensical and vicious propaganda pieces. It is also, incidentally, a public plea by Sokolsky for honest, unbiased journalism, a free press talk by a man secretly being paid by a private organization of industrialists while practicing the open profession of journalism. Sokolsky says, quote, "A government can only be as democratic as its press is free," unquote. This has been said before. Quote, "And now the Guild has switched from the AF of L to the CIO. That is altogether different. Here is not just a union of mutual protection. Here is the agency of revolution," unquote. The Guild passed the lie to Sokolsky. The Plutogog then declares he has noticed certain things happening in the press, and asks, quote, "Are these slips honest errors of judgment? Or does a Guild member poison the paper for which he works?" Unquote. Hypocrite, wow. He then predicts that if Lewis succeeds in getting the CIO established among news writers, quote, "he will go after the press," unquote, and, quote, "then this will happen. The CIO will issue orders that no newspaper can be published which does not advocate its policies or its candidates for office. Perhaps Haywood Broun, as president of the Guild, will become the American Goebbels. The American people would do well to grasp now exactly what is happening to them and to their sacred institutions. There is no minimizing the effects of the revolution. A process is at work to take over the government, to abolish democratic institutions, to put an end to human rights," unquote. And to think that all the emotion, this apparent forthrightness, this seeming rectitude was, as we now know, being displayed by a man who was, at that very moment, being investigated by the La Follette Committee as a Plutogog, a hired spokesman for special money interests. An amusing episode occurred at this time. Benjamin Stolberg, who later sold to Roy Howard the series of articles in which the Moscow herring was dragged all through the CIO, was still writing for the Nation. He had written, quote, "Another reactionary freelance writer is George Sokolsky, a rather tragic comic figure, for with his Eastern European Jewish background, he ought to know better than to incite the vigilante spirit. Big business enterprises distribute numerous reprints of his articles," unquote. Sokolsky replied, quote, "The fact that I prefer E.T. Weir and Tom Girdler to Earl Browder and Haywood Broun is a matter of taste, and I rather revel in the fact that my taste is different from Ben Stolberg's, because I started where he is. Also, I am more pleased that business associations like my writings and have reprints made because I believe in the American capitalist system. I advocate its continuance. I believe in organization for its perpetuation, and I am the enemy of every man who is seeking to destroy it. When I see a figure like John Lewis looming on the horizon, I am conscious of his similarity to Hitler," unquote. Commenting on these statements by this paid public relations agent of big business, Ernest L. Meyer of the Post quotes the following paragraph from Clinch Culkin's Spy Overhead, quote, "Strikebreakers may cease to look and smell like finks. They may look and smell like public relations men instead," unquote, and suggests that Sokolsky read and reread it. But Sokolsky went on with his propaganda. In November 1937, he ridiculed the work of the Institute for Propaganda Analysis and sought to liken himself to some of the greatest men of America and the best-known columnists. He wrote, quote, "I am personally a confirmed propagandist. Uncle Charlie, Professor Charles A. Beard, is a mighty propagandist. And another on that list is James T. Shotwell. Among current propagandists, the four I like best are Walter Lippmann, Dorothy Thompson, Westbrook Pegler, and Boke Carter." Unquote. One may well wonder whether the four colleagues like Mr. Sokolsky. In December, the La Follette Committee investigating corrupt practices and anti-labor activities on the part of corporations announced it would probe the National Association of Manufacturers. The People's Press hinted that Sokolsky and several others who had just addressed the NAM convention, quote, the Congress of American Industry, unquote, in New York, would be called. At that Congress, Sokolsky had spoken. The press paid no attention to him, with the exception of that quote-unquote voice of business, The Sun, which had a double-column headline. "Sees monsters in Wagner Act. Sokolsky says it created discontent and fear, calls wage-hour bill paralyzing." The word was getting around in journalistic circles that the La Follette Committee had the goods on Sokolsky. It would show that while he appeared as a columnist, along with Lippmann, Dorothy Thompson, Mark Sullivan, and others in the Herald Tribune, he was actually on the payroll of the steel corporations and the manufacturers. So what did Sokolsky do? He made a sort of semi-confession for the purpose of spiking the guns of the announced exposé. On December 20th, 1937, he wrote in his usual place in the Herald Tribune and syndicated papers,
quote, "Well, it was not long before I became a sort of consultant for the National Association of Manufacturers. What they wanted of me was my point of view, and then they seemed to go their own middle course. I never minded that. I know my own weakness for pushing too far and too hard, and I could not expect those who had something to risk to go along with me." What a pompous ass this guy must have been. Subsequently, I came into the same relationship with the American Iron and Steel Institute. Yeah, talk about how much they were paying you, though, jerk. And there I found some congenial spirits, but others who regarded me as a queer duck. I never really worried about those who did not like me, because they had their problems and their problems were not mine. They were seeking to save their companies, while I was interested in preserving the kind of capitalism which I liked in this country. Sounds like just a prize narcissist, this guy. We clashed, we parted company. Still, that did not stop businessmen from consulting me about things. And paying you, right, buddy? There is tremendous value in this relationship, value to you, particularly since I have been writing these columnar pieces. Journalism is supposed to be objective, but objectivity has the defect of always seeing things altogether from the outside. This relationship has given me an opportunity to see things from the inside. It has been fascinating and serious work. But through it all there has been this magnificent possibility that I might be doing something of value for a country which I happen to love, because I was yammering on a fundamental philosophy of life and my conservatism made me a Republican, unquote. Oh, just stop, dude. Just stop. Self-serving, narcissistic. Oh. Mr. Sokolsky concludes with a stirring prose poem, a national anthem, a credo, with 3 cheers for the United States, democracy, and, quote, the kind of capitalism which I like in this country, unquote. The NAM certainly got more in the way of enthusiasm than their weekly checks warranted. As for the Herald Tribune, it continued to publish the Sokolsky anti-labor, anti-union, red-baiting, reactionary propaganda, despite the fact its writer had confessed to being, quote-unquote, a sort of consultant of the NAM and having a, quote, relationship, unquote, with the American Steel and Iron Institute. This, too, is known as freedom of the press for Tory publishers. In January 1938, Sokolsky shook hands and forgave Ben Stolberg for his last year's criticism. Quote, Ben regarded me, and I suppose he still does, as a writing slave of the independent steel companies, unquote, wrote Sokolsky, giving the impression that things like that could never be. He continues, quote, now Ben Stolberg has written a dozen articles for the Scripps Howard papers in which he literally spills the beans. His description of communist activities within the CIO is sufficient to convince Tom Girdler that he was right. Ben Stolberg is in good company. Those of us who have been opposed to the CIO have taken our stand on an earlier recognition of the red poison, unquote. The fear of impending exposure continued to put Sokolsky on the defensive. He was probably aware by now that the La Follette Committee had, among books and records it had seized, and receipts Sokolsky had signed, for the advertising agency handling the NAM propaganda. He knew he would be exposed as secretly in the pay of the worst enemies of liberalism and labor. So he sought to drag in his fellow writers. In the Independent Journal of Columbia University, April 1st, 1938, he wrote an article sneering at the liberal columnists and praising the Tories. He continued, quote, I am the youngest and the poorest of columnists. I am what you call conservative. Pompous ass. Who was this guy? Many columnists are not exclusively newspapermen. Walter Lippmann wrote books related to foreign relations. Yeah, he sure did. As an associate of the British Fabian Socialists here in America, I bet he would have done that. Walter Lippmann. Hugh Johnson is a businessman. Haywood Broun is an officer of the Newspaper Guild and the CIO, which is a business that sometimes can be a profitable one. I am associated with the National Association of Manufacturers and am often consulted by large business organizations as to what their policies should be on public questions and labor problems. Such relations give us more experience and better relate us to the events of the moment and make it possible for us to be closer to the actual current of events. The public should be told, however, what a man's relationships are. And you're only telling them now because you got caught. Because you're about to be caught and you know it. Nice. Continuing. Many reporters develop into public relations counsels, a profession which is going to develop in this country. No large business, no labor union, no charitable organization will be able to conduct its affairs without adequate public relations. In this field of column writing, there are no prejudices or antagonisms, unquote. No, none whatever. Sokolsky invents an alter ego he calls Sam, who expresses a nice fascist viewpoint. Quote, politics is just a lot of guys selling us marijuana cigarettes, unquote. Quote, so far as I'm concerned, the old deal and the new deal and the raw deal and all the stuff the politicians feed us is just plain cow feed, unquote. Quote, it isn't only in Washington that the politicians are lousy. Go to any state capital, unquote. Then he has his fling at the communists in this manner. Quote, I met a female communist the other day. You can spot them easy. They wear cotton stockings and look like hell. So I didn't want to pick her up, unquote. What a scumbag. People were reading this guy and trusting him. This was at a time the silk boycott was growing. In fact, it had become so serious that Dow Jones were reporting it as affecting Japanese economics. Sokolsky was still wearing pro-Japanese pieces. It so happened that many of our most beauteous film stars were displaying cotton stockings to help the boycott, still claiming, quote, no prejudices or antagonisms, unquote. Sokolsky, on March 7th, wrote a vicious Jew-baiting column in which he said, quote, a communist parade looks Jewish, unquote. If he had been in the pay of Hitler rather than Girdler, he could not have done better. On July 21st, 1938, Sokolsky was exposed by the La Follette Committee. The Post and World Telegram gave the news the front page, featuring Sokolsky's name. Even the propagandist's other employer, the Herald Tribune, used the name in the second part of the heading. But the Times left Sokolsky out of the head and used a minimum of the news, even less than the Herald Tribune did. It was shown that Hill and Knowlton, Steel Corporation press agents, paid Sokolsky $28,599 from June 1936 to February 1938, chiefly for service to the American Iron and Steel Institute. Prostitute. A journalistic prostitute, caught in the act. The propagandists also contracted with the NAM for $1,000 a month for the Sokolsky services and paid him the entire sum. They also sent out bulletins describing Sokolsky as, quote, a communist and a radical. He has now reformed and has a real message to deliver to those of us who are interested in the welfare of industry. He calls a spade, unquote. But not a check. After this exposure, it was expected by all persons who knew anything about the code of ethics and the canons of journalism that at least an apology would be forthcoming. But this came forth instead, an editorial in the Herald Tribune called What is Pressure? Quote, what is pressure anyway? It is exercised on a newspaper in 1,000 ways, some of them trivial and laughable, a few of them serious and even dangerous, but for the most part not at all sinister. A publisher runs into an old college chum at his club. The chum buttonholes the publisher and argues with much eloquence and logic that the publisher's paper has been paying much too little attention to some pressing problems, any pressing problems, from grade crossing removal to whether men should remove their hats for ladies in elevators. That is pressure, unquote. Boy, does that sound like the character Pig from the character, Squealer the pig. Squealer, from Animal Farm. No, it's not that pigs can't sleep in beds. It's only that pigs can't sleep in beds with sheets, you guys. Yeah, good old Squealer. Continuing. And so on to more serious pressures, such as the KKK, but not a word about the Sokolsky case. And Sokolsky himself continued on his Monday way with an anti-liberal article concluding, quote, Dr. Wirtz's prophecy will come true. Roosevelt will be the Kerensky of the American Revolution. His New Deal is a prelude to fascism, unquote. Up to now, it had been communism. If the La Follette Committee had discovered that Sokolsky or any other columnist on any big paper had been secretly or semi-secretly in the pay of any radical or liberal organization, the scandal would have rocked the journalistic foundations of the nation. If it were proven that a columnist was getting Moscow gold, there would have been hell to pay. But when it is found that Sokolsky was merely getting anti-Moscow gold, not a word was said in any Tory newspaper in the country, and the agent of the special interests brazenly resumed his department in the newspaper, which annually holds a forum at which not only freedom of the press, but the ethics of that freedom are lauded to the skies by Mr. Sokolsky's columnar colleagues. Hypocrites. The House of Press Lords has called no special meeting to discuss the Sokolsky affair. Well, oh boy. Sounds like what happens to Clintons in the state of Arkansas. They get caught doing everything under the sun. The sheriffs, state troopers have all the goods on them, but there's nothing that can be done beyond that, because the judiciary is in the pocket of the bad guys, so Clinton walks. You see that in that film, The Clinton Chronicles, and the book, too. So here, this columnist got away with it. It just keeps on going with his job. Wow. This is your news, folks. This is your news. And now you're watching it on television. It's still happening, probably worse, the corruption. You're still watching it. You're still trusting it. Nice, nice. Okay, folks, these have been chapters 3 and 4 from part 2 of Lords of the Press by George Seldes from 1938, this memory-hold classic. You've been listening to Rejected Knowledge.